Western legend has universal appeal. It is based firmly on history, a history which had not quite vanished when motion pictures began. Tumbleweeds, 1925. The movies not only recreated Western history, they prolonged it. They gave a second chance to hundreds of cowboys thrown out of work with the passing of the Old West.
The first of the cowboys that came down there to ride as the posses and the extras were all practical cowboys from Montana, Wyoming, Texas, Arizona. They'd come there from all over the West. They were really tough cowboys.
The man who began it all was the hero of 100 dime novels, a true Westerner, a former Indian scout and buffalo hunter, William Cody, Buffalo Bill. Cody took the history of the West and turned it into a circus. His Wild West was colorful entertainment. With the help of real Indians and real cowboys, he spread the legend across the world. The film industry could do little to compete. They were established in the East. It took longer to reach the West than to make a Western, so they painted the canyons on the studio backdrop. Who cared? It was cheap. And the Nickelodeon audiences enjoyed what they paid for. The industry's migration west, when it happened, was enormously important. The landscape enhanced the Wild West drama and brought the movies a new audience. The Untamed West came as a shock for the actors. The leading lady, brought out by D.W. Griffith, was Blanche Sweet.
Working in desert land is a very disagreeable and dirty business. Hot and perspiring, your makeup was running and trying to keep looking good. And they'd come back at the end of the day, oh so hot, and oh so dirty, and oh so thirsty. We were almost as thirsty as the people who were dying of thirst and crossing the desert.
People were still crossing the desert. 200 miles away from Los Angeles, real pioneers were struggling to reclaim the Imperial Valley, for California was still being settled. But the Old West was dying. The last great cattle drives were photographed for westerns and for posterity. One or two of the big ranches leased space to movie companies. Arriving from the east, film people were delighted to find the atmosphere of the Old West still prevailing. The cowboys who met them were often hired on the spot as local color. One such cowboy was Tom Mix. Tom Mix was picked up casually to handle the cattle. He wasn't interested in that job, which he did every day, but he was keen to act. He not only acted, he became a cowboy director, churning out a series of unpretentious westerns, the cowboy equivalent of home movies. His films, full of stunts and humor, were the favorite westerns of his fellow cowboys. Times were equally hard for the outlaws. Al Jennings of Oklahoma relived his own exploits on film. His films had a moral: crime does not pay. In his first feature of 1918, Jennings reconstructed a daring Texas bank raid. Now that they've been spotted, the outlaws resort to the process Jennings called cleaning the streets. Jennings had so little money for his pictures that instead of constructing sets, he had to shoot in real western towns. This is Tehachapi, California. Jennings showed a West the movies usually avoided, sordid and unglamorous, with families living in sod huts dug out of the soil. He may have been a romantic at heart, but he showed the outlaw's life as it really was. The public did not respond. Their idea of an outlaw was William S. Hart. A stage actor from New York, he was the Westerner of popular imagination. As early as 1916, he had established the kind of behavior we still expect from the Western hero. Hart always tried to make his films authentic, even attempting Indian Sign Language.
William S. Hart, he signed language like the women did, and the men criticized him. Now, say Bill Hart, he would, well, let me just say this. Long time ago, white man and Indian friend. Now, he would say, long time ago, white man and Indian friend. Just keep swaying, you know? And they confuse you. It's confusing. And when he say question means yes and no. Your heart says yeah, your heart says no. He wouldn't do that. He'd say, question.
Hart personified one of the legends of the West, good struggling against evil. Hell's Hinges was one of his most successful films. It had an Old Testament grandeur. cowboys adored Bill Hart, but they didn't share his uncritical love for the West. Conditions were harsh, unemployment was rife. More and more of them came to Hollywood.
My background as a cowboy was, I was born in Idaho, Nez Perce Reservation. Later on moved into Salmon River Country, and my folks had stock ranch in Salmon River Country. And I worked on the ranch until I was 19. And I left there and came to California.
Some cowboys went into pictures straight from the Los Angeles stockyards. $5 a day was hard to resist when life on the range offered that much a week. With so many cowboys in pictures, the atmosphere on location was not too different from life on the range.
Big shots lived at the hotel, and the cowboys, they had a barracks, well, it was a big basement, you know, and they put about 20 bunks in there. But you had a table, we could play poker and cards, and the only difference was that you didn't have the old smell of the sweaty blankets and the sweaty saddles in a regular ranch bunkhouse that you'd have, and sometimes you wouldn't have as many flies around as you would have on the regular bunkhouse.
The West was really the West. I remember when I was working with Tom Mix, and we went to Prescott, Arizona, which was the capital, I think, then. The hotel had a balcony, I guess, you know, all the stores did, that came out over the sidewalk. You've seen them in the movies. And my mother and I were standing out there when two cowboys drove up and paced off, and one shot the other one, and then he got on his horse and rode away, and everybody ran out. Well, today it would be just like a movie, and I guess then it was just like a movie. I don't know what the outcome was, but he evidently had what's known as a grudge.
The cowboys brought their frontier ways with them to Hollywood.
There were probably more shootings among those cowboys down in Gower Gulch in Hollywood than there ever was in Dodge City. But those fellas were, I knew fellas down there that had been run out of Wyoming, got out of there on stolen horses, one jump ahead of a sheriff.
Hollywood quickly filled up with unemployed cowboys. The most determined hovered at a spot they called the Waterhole.
When I was in pictures, a waterhole was at Hollywood and Cahuenga Boulevard. When the cowboys wasn't working, they'd all congregate there so that in case something came up and in some of the studios emergency needed some cowboys, they'd know where to come and pick them out. You know, they could pick them right there and get them. Otherwise, they wouldn't know where to find them.
There were rivalries, lost tempers, barroom brawls. One such brawler was Yakima Jim.
Yak, I can remember, he was very belligerent. And in the bar, he'd come over, and he was a big, strong fellow. And he'd throw a hook around somebody's neck and say another word to me and I'll crack your neck. He was always about that, always belligerent. Well, down in Hollywood, he came down to Hollywood, and my double was a fellow called Tom Bay. And Tom had killed a man over in Oklahoma before he'd ever come to Hollywood. So in an argument with Jim this particular day, up in a room, 3 or 4 of them were there together, and they were all drinking. And Yakima Jim just whipped out a switchblade, and he said, "I'll just cut your belly open." Well, he said it to the wrong man. And Tom Bay just reached in the waistband of his breeches here and pulled out a 6-shooter and killed him. And that was the end of Yakima Jim.
Another notorious fighter was Art Acord, world champion rodeo rider, one of the most colorful and unpredictable of all the cowboy stars.
He had a little outlaw streak in him. He'd get a couple of drinks, and if there was no one that he didn't know or a stranger that he could pick a fight with, he'd pick his best friend and challenge him for a fight. And he was just a fellow that you couldn't depend on, but a guy that you couldn't help but like. In fact, I had 3 fights with him one afternoon, and the next morning when I woke up, I was pretty well get out of bed and started to dress, and I couldn't hardly get my shoes on, and I sore all over. And I thought, well, if that bird ever comes near me again, I'll just kill him and get it over with. So my phone rang, and Acord, he said, "Have you got anything to drink over there yet?" And I said, "Art, I have, but not for you. Don't come near me." I've had all he said, well, I'll be over pretty quick. I said, you do, and I'll whip you right in the hall at the door. I was living in an apartment at the time. And he said, okay. Sure enough, he knocked on the door. When I opened the door, one eye was swelled shut. He was really beat up. And he said, Jack, what did you hit me with? So I kind of felt sorry for him. So we had a drink and sit down. 15 minutes, good friends again.
Oh, he'd fight anybody anytime for fun, money, or old clothes, you know.
Tom Mix fused the wildness and glamour of the cowboy legend with his own extravagance. Born athlete, he staged his fights with a realism which went far beyond the demands of the camera, as stuntman Harvey Perry learned to his cost.
So now he runs down the stairs and I meet him coming up the stairs. And he's supposed to kick at me and then take a punch at me. Well, he kicked me with those high-heel boots on in the chest, and I went back down on the floor and I got up and he hit me. He always wore gloves, if you remember, white gloves. But under those gloves, when he did a fight, he had tape. He wanted to be tough. So he hit me, and I went on my behind again. And he said, I'm sorry, it slipped. And we did it again, and he did the same thing. But I got up, and I hit him and knocked him down. And I said, sorry, Tom, it slipped. But we got along very fine after that. Tom was a very flamboyant sort of a character. Now, at the Vernon Bar, where they had all the fights in the old days, the longest bar in the world was down there. It was about 1.5 blocks long. And 3 or 4 times before he became famous as Tom Mix, Tom would take his horse down there and burst through the doors, duck his head, come through with a white hat on, shoot his guns off and says, Tom Mix, boys, the drinks are on me.
Tom Mix had begun as a real cowboy, but he lived in an age which welcomed exaggeration and adored extravagant showmanship. By the 1920s, Tom Mix had transformed his life into a Wild West show.
But when Mix got through with his silver buckles on the breeches and silver buckles on the boots and fringes hanging down without a bib and fringes at the elbow, he was dressed up like a Christmas tree and no one ever equaled him.
Terrific liar, but not in a menacing way. It was always in the way of entertainment. People would show up on the set and they'd want to hear something about his past before he came into picture, so he'd tell them a wild story about being a deputy sheriff or a sheriff and horses shot out from under him and capturing outlaws and all this. And it was really terrific. The first time I heard this, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And after the crowd left, I said, Tom, you kind of handled the truth a little bit reckless, don't you? He said, what the hell do you mean reckless? She said, they're here for entertainment, so I give them a reel out of one of my pictures.
Mix inspired legions of movie cowboys who followed him. But there were other models. A prop man who worked briefly with Mix in 1926 was John Wayne.
When I was a boy, there were two pretty well-known characters in motion pictures. And Tom Mix was a flamboyant type and wore the rodeo clothes. But Harry Carey always wore a good hat, good pair of boots, and what he wore in between didn't matter too much. And he had a style of acting that has now become the way of acting in our business.
Like William S. Hart, Harry Carey was one of the few cowboy actors without experience of the range.
You see, he was not a typical cowboy in any sense of the word. He was a romantically, he was in love with the West. Absolutely in love with the West and with the pioneer spirit. That's why we had the ranch and the whole business. He just loved being a cowboy. And he was a New York guy. Oh, we were terribly Western. Oh, brother, were we Western.
Carey helped a young assistant named John Ford become a director. Ford was another Easterner who loved the West. Together they made a series of romantic but accurate westerns.
We all moved out to Newhall, you know, and lived in a little 3-room house. And we slept out in the alfalfa patch in bedrolls. Harry was a great collector of dogs. If he saw a dog running along the road that didn't have a home, he'd put it in the car and take it with him, take it home. And we had about 8 or 9 dogs that we'd lock up in the garage of this little place at night. And then in order to get Ford out of the bedroll in the morning, Harry was an early riser. Why, Harry'd go turn the dogs all loose, and they'd come over and lick his face and wake him up.
Carey starred in Ford's Straight Shooting. It had the kind of encounter that would soon feature in so many westerns.
He tried to be kind of natural, act natural. There's no way of being natural on the screen, or you lose the tempo. You know, you have to keep things going and try and get your personality through, which is what Harry could do. I loved him because I'd known him for years, and I was a young man, and he was an older man, and I'd had a lifetime of association with Harry and Ollie. And when Harry died, naturally, I was there, and I'd known and loved the both of them.
In John Ford's The Searchers of 1956, in which Olive Carey appeared, John Wayne paid his own tribute.
At the end of the picture, when I brought back little Natalie Woods, who was a baby then, and turned her over to these folks, Jack had a scene that just included a dark doorway. And I was outside, and they came in and came by the camera and turned around. Now, it had been a heartwarming scene when we brought this little girl back. And Harry hadn't been dead very long. And I loved Ollie, and it was emotional. And as they went in the door in the dark and got out of sight, and it was just me in the door with the wind blowing, I thought of Harry Carey, and he had a stance which was something to that effect, where he put his left hand on his right arm, and he did this incessantly in pictures. Well, when they took the little girl past the camera and there was just a dark frame, Ollie looked around at me, and I just took the pose, and geez, the tears poured out of her eyes, and it was a lovely, dramatic moment in my life, and I'm sure in hers.
The Covered Wagon of 1923 was an event which transformed the Western. Romantic in its story, authentic in its portrayal of the events of 1848, the subject was very close to its producer, Jesse Lasky.
Well, he wanted to make the Covered Wagon because he recalled the stories of his grandfather, who had arrived in California in 1848. And he had always dreamed of, as a child, of these ancestral exploits of crossing with the long trains of wagons, dragging themselves across the vast spaces of the West. And he saw this as the opportunity to lift the Western, which had always been a rather low-budget kind of potboiler film, into an epic.
The chief cameraman on the production was Carl Brown.
On the Covered Wagon, I saw pioneer women and their husbands and their children going about their daily business without any attention from me or from crews or instructions from anybody else, doing what they had been doing all of their lives. They were as much at home with a camp kettle and a campfire and a board from the back of the wagon to roll out biscuits, to take flour out of a barrel or a sack, to know how to do what it is to be done to keep a normal, healthy, comfortable family life on the wild prairie.
The parents of director James Cruise were Mormons who had crossed the plains in covered wagons and settled in Utah. It was in Utah that Cruise chose to make the picture. As a boy, he used to watch the covered wagons moving past the family ranch. Everyone working on the film saw the past come alive as the wagons assembled.
The first scene they shot was that train of wagons at the start of the trek across the West. And something happened to me. I said, I'm so glad I'm in this picture. This is going to be a great picture. There was something so real about it. They had advertised all through the West and everywhere. Anybody who had a Conestoga wagon would be given, I believe, $2 a day, and they're stock fed, and they would be in this great picture. And those Conestoga wagons, the covered wagons, were heirlooms, and then they were still in use on farms and ranches.
The greatest peril for the original pioneers came from the Indians whose land this was. Colonel Tim McCoy was a recognized authority.
So They contacted me and said, would I be interested in rounding up about 500 Indians out of the Plains tribes to make the covered wagon. So I took leave, went down, and I arrived at location with 2 solid trainloads of Indians. I had Indians, squaws, papooses, horses, dogs, teepees, the whole works, you see. We got them down there. Nobody else could talk to them but me. So I became the technical director of the covered wagon.
He was the one that brought them down from there with their own equipment. We watched them the first day or two put up, and the squaws did most of the work, putting up their tepees, and they lived in their own atmosphere. And he told them the story each day in sign language, and you never had to retake an Indian shot. It was perfect from the first take. They lived that story, they relived it. I remember one woman, when the Indians attacked us, and she suggested that she put her child in one of the empty water barrels on the side. And Jim Cruz got a lot of ideas from these people who were not professional actors. I think that was maybe the spirit of that picture was in the people who made it.
The sheer logistics of the production caused delay after delay. The studio tried to recall the company. James Cruz warned the extras they might not be paid, but they all agreed to carry on, however long it took.
The picture was running way over budget. We ran into bad weather. It snowed when we didn't want snow. So we shot along through the snow, and they turned out to be the best scenes in the picture, naturally. You know, it always happens that way.
The crossing of the River Platte was the biggest challenge, as it had been for the pioneers. The first attempt, dragging the wagons across on cables, was a total failure.
Terribly sad day. They made a mistake in putting chains on the tongue of the wagon so that they would really get across, and the first two horses drowned. I couldn't work that day. I went back to my tent. Jim said, well, we'll dismiss and we'll just do some other scenes.
The only thing to do was to go back reluctantly to what had worked so well for the pioneers. We caulked the wagons, we fixed the barrels on the sides so they would serve as buoyancy. We hitched up the oxen, we put them in proper position, and we suggested to them, politely but firmly, by means of pistol shots and cracking whips, that it might be a very good idea to go over that way.
Covered Wagon was a difficult picture to make, fraught with hardship and danger. It was the first of its kind. Since 1923, hundreds of westerns have dealt with the same theme. Some may even have done it better. But none can match the simple grandeur of the original. For it was made by people with a personal stake in the past, descendants of the pioneers who were themselves pioneers. The success of the Covered Wagon inspired an era of Western epics. Director John Ford was profoundly influenced by the Covered Wagon. On New Year's Day, 1924, he began work on The Iron Horse, about the next wave of pioneers, the builders of the Transcontinental Railroad. Ford was fascinated with the West and its history. He recreated it with careful accuracy. He enjoyed the rugged conditions, but for the extras, sent out from Hollywood with no idea of their fate, it was a different matter. Property master Lefty Huff had to cope.
This was the biggest movement of any picture out of Hollywood that had ever been made. No one had ever attempted to take this kind of a movement out of Hollywood, because this was basically in the motion picture infancy. There was nothing, you had no barometer to go by. So they hired a circus train. They piled about 200 people on it, and we went up there and made a picture.
It was winter in Nevada. There was no heat on the circus train. The temperature was sub-zero. To combat the cold, the cast stayed in their costumes. The train was infested with fleas. People moved out and lived in the sets. Reconstruction slowly became reality.
Most of the picture actually was shot off the cuff. It was discussed, but there had been several writers, and Ford had his own conception of how he was going to play it. And I don't think there was over 3 or 4 scripts on the whole troupe. We had Chinese there that had been working for the railroad for 50 years, and they were wonderful. We had about 35 of those. They were all retired. They came out as a lark to do this for the picture.
Among the Chinese were several who had actually helped to build the Western Pacific half a century before.
There was real suffering in that picture. Christ, it was cold as hell. You get out there in the day and have to work on that truck, and the wind blows in the snow. And the Indians have to go around with no clothes on. It's a murder. Jesus, it's terrible. Women take an awful beating, the moving the town.
The railroad advanced. The railhead towns were torn down to be rebuilt further along the track. Even when the camera stopped, the atmosphere of the Old West remained.
There was one bootlegger that was up there. He sold the worst whiskey of anybody in the world. I want to tell you, brother, it must have been 200 proof, because you're ready to crawl, and believe me, we needed it. Now, the circus tent, when we put the circus tent up, we had so many fights in there, we had to take the ketchup bottles off the table. So you can figure it out for yourself how rough it was. Then we had a half a dozen dogs that followed around. The one dog that strolled in at the graveyard at the end when the train pulls out of town, the white dog stand, they called him Foreground. We had that dog and a half a dozen shots. These are things that you steal. Ford is lucky as hell just to get those kind of things.
In 1869, the bloodshed and hardship were vindicated. A steel highway linked the East Coast to the West. John Ford brought it to life with the fidelity of a newsreel. His reconstruction was, for him, the next best thing to being there. Pioneering did not end with the 19th century. Settlers were still moving west at the same time as the Hollywood pioneers. It was appropriate that the last epic silent western, The Winning of Barbara Worth, should recreate one of the last epic ventures of pioneering, the reclamation of the Imperial Valley in Southern California.
The nearest place that I could find that would resemble what we were going to do was up in the Black Rock Desert, up in between Nevada and Idaho and Oregon. And there, I'm not so sure, but what in making the picture, that the actors and all of us making the picture went through probably more hardships than the people did in settling the Imperial Valley. I mean, around noon, they would have these little baby tornadoes. Now, these little hurricanes that I say that roll about from the atmosphere, you would see one start out on the desert, you'd come whipping up the sand with it, and one day it swept right through our set, and the Barbara Worth Hotel just went right on out with it. It scattered it in splinters out for a half a mile across the desert. We had every rancher, every cowboy, every real man with horses and all. We hired them with the horse and their saddle, and they came in from all the little town of Gerlach, another little town of Sulphur, another Winnemucca, all the way around. Now, we kept those people there. They Western Pacific put a railroad track in for us to sidetrack our cars, and I told you the water that we drank and the water the horses drank and everything came from the Feather River 80 and 100 miles away, and we started in to build this town. Many people think that locations are not too important. To me, I think they're just as important as the costumes, the casting. It's part of the casting, part of the costume, part of the production. And so many people pay little attention to it. They did then, but I always paid attention that it was one of the most important ingredients that went into a picture, because it was a visual medium, and that is certainly what you're looking at.
The first westerns had been shot against painted backdrops. Now they were set against majestic scenery, and all the skill of Hollywood was brought to bear on the great flood of 1906. When the Colorado River overflowed its banks, the dams could not hold back the floodwater. The resulting catastrophe wiped out settlements across the desert and created a lake called the Salton Sea. In all westerns, there has to be a villain. In Barbara Worth, it is the corrupt speculator. His graft has caused weakness in the dam. The flood is inevitable. So is retribution. Talkies ended the careers of most of the real cowboys. Outdoor pictures were dropped for a time from studio schedules. As the Old West faded into history, so did the men who remembered it. But the Western lives on.